All right, everyone. So I'm going to have a brief lecture here about Zitkala-Sa. And I had you read her because she is unlike the rest of the authors that you've read so far. So Zitkala-Sa was a Native American writer. She was born on the Yankton Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Her father was a white man who abandoned the family when she was a baby, so she never met him. And she is a very influential and important figure as far as not only feminist rights, but also the rights of Native Americans. So she actually was one of the children who was taken to the first. It was a school for for basically whitewashing Indian children. So the goal of the school was they felt like the Native American population had so so many issues that the only way to quote unquote save the population was to essentially whitewash the children and make them Christian and quote unquote civilized and all these different things. So it was actually a program where they would take Native American children into these schools, and your book has a really amazing picture of a before and after. So you see that they not only physically transform the children, but they work to transform them spiritually and influence their education. So Zitkala-Sa became highly educated, but she also became a fierce proponent for Native American rights and the preservation of Native American culture. So she went on to work in the government, and she basically used her experiences to help form government policies to protect Native American culture and life. And so a lot of the experiences that she portrays in this section are experiences that a lot of these Native American children went through, and it was more than just changing their physicality or their spirituality or their language. It was quite often a humongous change in culture. So Zitkala-Sa, I had you guys read 3 short sections. She starts with calling this the land of red apples, and this is because the missionaries came and they promised that this was a land filled with all these wonderful treasures, including these beautiful red apples that they would all get when they got there. So again, it's this sort of idea of the land of milk and honey is awaiting you just over in the next part of the country. And at this point, Manifest Destiny has been declared achieved. So we've had the closing of the frontier in 1890, and we've accomplished our goal as far as our divine destiny to move into the West and settle the West. So now we're really taking these cultures that are in the West and trying to reappropriate them back into white culture, essentially. So her writing is a critique of this, a very blatant and harsh critique of this, and she's doing it from the perspective of a first perspective of an adult, but she's speaking of what her experiences were as a child. So she's really working to connect with her audience on the difficulties and the fears instilled in the children who were in this program, because it was the children who were expected to sort of whitewash and move on and assimilate cultures between Native American and white cultures. So you notice at the beginning, and I'm going to go with section 1 first, she talks about all these markers of her physicality. She talks about her long hair. She talks about her moccasin feet. And she talks about this journey that they took to the school and all of the sense of isolation she had for the first time in her life. So she's never felt isolated. Even though her family was abandoned by their father, there was a community surrounding her. And she describes the reservation itself as this sort of area of complete emotional and physical freedom. So she keeps calling the people who are looking at her the staring, pale faces. So you immediately see a separation of the people who are watching them and this group of young Native Americans who are going to the school. And she has this beautiful sort of poetry within this prose here, where she talks about she's riding the train and she sees the telegraph pole, and she's so excited because it's a marker of civilization that she recognizes. So everything else is very foreign to her, but this she recognizes, and really she's putting this in here to show us that there's incoming, it's essentially a symbol, an incoming influx of civilization and industrialization onto the freedom of the Western lands. So we have, things literally getting fenced in, and we have technology making its way in. We have the telegraph poles making their way in. And she says she used to put her ear up against the telegraph pole and wonder what the white man did that made it, had done to hurt it, because she used to hear it moan and sigh. So you get this really interesting, subtle critique of industrialization coming into the free Western lands, and that's exactly what's happening to the people as well. They're being appropriated like objects and essentially tried to be turned into something else. So she gets to the school and she says that she's tossed around this, and you see that there's essentially an attempt on the part of the people who are working in the school, the white people, to try and make the children feel welcome in the way that they know how, but there's a cultural differentiation here. She says she's tossed in the air, and the girl, you can imagine the woman trying to make her feel happy and make her feel welcome and hold her as a young child, and she says she's never been tossed about like a plaything by her own mother. So you see a cultural resistance immediately, but also a misunderstanding between the white people who are running this school and the cultural norms of the children that are in the school. And she says that the second part, the part 2 on page 1094 to 1095, she talks about the traumatic cutting of her long hair. So again, we have the symbolic significance of her hair, and she talks about how in the culture, in Indian culture, to have your hair shorn by an enemy is a sign of weakness, or it's a sign of defeat. So you wear the long hair as a badge of honor and a badge of bravery. And she says, the people who run the school don't understand this. They only see it as hair. So she has this beautiful moment where each of these kids are brought in a line, and they're very meticulous and they're very straightforward, and they've sort of lost a bit of their freedom and their, what she calls, wild abandon. And so she says she has this moment where she thinks about giving in, but she realizes, no, I'm strong. She says, I do not have to submit because I am strong. No, I will not submit. I will struggle first. So this is a really significant line because it's very symbolic of what she thinks the native culture should be doing against the imposing forces of the white culture that's coming in and trying to quote unquote civilize their culture. And so what she says, so she runs upstairs, and she note that this section is also tied to the prayer, and she talks about how she doesn't understand the norms as far as praying goes, because her religion is different. And she only mentions this in passing. She doesn't critique religion outright until we get to the next section. So in the end, she says she hid under the bed, and they eventually found her and tied her to a chair to cut her hair. And they did not understand what they were doing was essentially, cutting a part of her off, cutting a part of her out as a Native American. So she compares herself that she says, I was one of many little animals driven by a herder. So she really brings this, it's a less than human treatment is what she's equating it to, from the white people who run the school to these Indian children. And she talks about this routine that they have, and this woman who used to check mark every day whether they were there or not. And it's an interesting dichotomy because she has this animal language in there, once again, in section 5 on page 1096. She says, I have many times trudged in a day's harness, heavy-footed, like a dumb, sick brute. So she says, I just tried to survive. I tried to get through this without using my mind and my heart and all these different things. And they treated me like an animal, and I felt like one. And then she talks about her friend who passed away, and this girl was ill, and they did not understand, the diseases were different, and the immunizations that they were used to were different. And so this Indian girl is dying, this Native American girl is dying, and she says on the bed, she talks disjointedly about Jesus and God, and she sees the Bible on the bed, and she hears the muttering, which we're assuming is prayer, and then she sees these rows of jars where they're trying to feed her different potions and concoctions. She says, she calls all this a cruel neglect of their physical ills, and she resents the people for doing this. And then she has a unique statement here on the very top of 1097. She says, "I blamed the hardworking, well-meaning, ignorant woman who is inculcating our hearts in our hearts her superstitious ideas." So she uses the language that they probably use against her to classify their beliefs as superstitious. But she says she understands what they're trying to do. They're well-meaning and they're hardworking people. She doesn't resent them for that. But what she means is she resents their ignorance of her own culture. And this is really symbolic of the cultural clash that we're having against Native Americans at this time. Trail of Tears was 60 years before, but we still have this misunderstanding of Native American culture. And that's why Zitkala-Sa goes on to become this incredible government figure. She's a writer, she's a feminist, she does all these amazing things for the Native American culture. And so that's why she's so important. And she leaves us on the section saying she would continue actively testing the chains that were against them as an individual. So that's why I had you guys read Zitkala-Sa. I hope you enjoyed her. She's really unique. She's really a significant figure as well. And again, it's one of those marginalized voices that you may not always get to read in studying American literature. So I want to make sure that we have a really good, well-rounded understanding of different facets of society at this time. So that's it for Zitkala-Sa, and if you'll go ahead and move on to the next activity.